What do you do with a building that was never meant to have a future? Structure designed to survive the destruction of a city, yet left standing after the war that justified its existence had vanished. In the years following Germany's defeat, that question confronted officials in several shattered cities. Across Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, enormous concrete masses still rose above the ruins. Their guns were silent, their crews were gone. But the towers remained. Railways needed rebuilding, housing was desperately scarce, and governments struggled with shortages of steel, fuel, and money. These colossal structures seemed almost untouched by the catastrophe around them. War had ended. The Flak Towers had not. When Germany surrendered, the military value of the Flak Towers disappeared almost overnight. As anti-aircraft fortresses, they had been designed to withstand direct attack while providing heavy anti-aircraft fire and protected shelter space for civilians. By the end of the conflict, dozens of these massive reinforced concrete complexes still stood in major urban centers. Some had walls more than 3 meters thick. Certain sections contained thousands of tons of steel reinforcement buried inside concrete so dense that even wartime bombing had failed to destroy them. Their survival created an immediate post-war dilemma. Cities urgently needed to clear debris and rebuild essential infrastructure. Yet the resources required to remove the towers often exceeded what local authorities could realistically provide. The contrast was striking. Entire districts lay in ruins. Streets were blocked by collapsed buildings. Utility networks barely functioned, yet above this destruction stood structures that appeared almost permanent. In Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, residents returning to damaged neighborhoods could see these giant forms dominating the skyline. Their military purpose had ended, but their physical presence shaped the landscape of post-war recovery. For city planners attempting to redesign damaged urban areas, towers became obstacles that could neither be ignored nor easily removed. Economic realities quickly influenced every discussion about their future. Post-war governments faced enormous reconstruction costs. Millions required housing, material production needed restoration. Transportation systems demanded repair. Against these urgent priorities, spending vast sums on demolishing concrete fortresses offered little immediate return. Engineers began calculating what removal would actually require. The numbers were discouraging. Explosives alone represented a significant expense, while labor shortages and equipment limitations further complicated the task. Even if a tower could be successfully demolished, authorities then faced the challenge of clearing tens of thousands of tons of rubble from already congested urban environments. The problem extended beyond simple demolition. Flak towers had been constructed under wartime conditions with durability as a primary objective. Forced concrete was poured in enormous quantities. Structural redundancy ensured that even substantial damage would not cause collapse. During the war, this had protected military equipment and civilian shelter areas. After the war, it transformed demolition into a technical challenge unlike ordinary building removal. Engineers examining the structures often concluded that conventional methods would be insufficient. Towers had effectively become artificial cliffs embedded within cities. In Berlin, officials initially viewed removal as desirable but uncertain. The city faced unprecedented devastation. Large areas required complete reconstruction. Planners hoped to reshape urban districts that had been heavily damaged. Several towers occupied locations considered strategically important for future development, yet early surveys revealed the immense difficulty involved. Equipment capable of handling structures of such scale was limited. Fuel remained scarce. Construction resources were already stretched thin. Every decision carried opportunity costs. Money spent destroying a tower could instead support housing construction, repair, or utility restoration. Meanwhile, the towers themselves entered an unusual period of limbo. Some were inspected by occupying authorities concerned about military remnants. Others became temporary storage locations simply because their interiors remained structurally sound. Massive rooms designed to protect equipment and civilians from bombardment offered dry, secure spaces in cities where countless buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Though their intended function had vanished, practical needs encouraged temporary reuse while longer-term decisions remained unresolved. In Hamburg, similar questions emerged. The city had suffered extensive destruction, yet several flak towers survived. Their immense bulk presented both a challenge and a temptation. Demolition would be costly, Retention would complicate urban planning. Officials examined alternatives ranging from partial removal to adaptation for civilian purposes. Towers occupied valuable urban land, but removing them entirely could consume resources urgently needed elsewhere. Reconstruction priorities shifted from emergency survival toward long-term development. Debates surrounding these structures grew more complex. The situation in Vienna introduced another layer of difficulty. Like many German cities, Vienna inherited several surviving flak tower complexes that would remain among the largest wartime structures left standing in Europe. Their dimensions were extraordinary. Some rose more than 50 meters above surrounding districts. Their concrete shells contained such immense quantities of material that demolition estimates became intimidating even before detailed planning began. Austrian authorities faced a question that would persist for decades: whether removing these giants was truly practical at all. First serious demolition attempts revealed just how difficult the task would be. Engineers developed plans involving large explosive charges placed within carefully selected structural points. Expectations were often optimistic on paper. The mathematics appeared straightforward. In practice, the towers behaved differently. Their massive construction absorbed explosive force with remarkable efficiency. Instead of collapsing neatly, portions of the structures frequently remained standing. What appeared from a distance to be a single building was, in reality, a deeply interconnected system of reinforced compartments capable of resisting catastrophic failure. Each unsuccessful or partially successful demolition effort carried consequences. Additional explosives increased costs. Extended operations consumed manpower. Safety concerns expanded as surrounding neighborhoods slowly repopulated. Authorities learned that bringing down a tower was only the beginning. Moving the resulting debris represented an equally daunting challenge. Mountains of broken concrete had to be transported through cities already struggling with damaged roads and limited transport capacity. Logistical burden often rivaled the demolition itself. As these realities became clear, attitudes gradually shifted. What initially seemed like temporary problems increasingly looked like permanent features. Urban planners began considering scenarios in which certain towers might remain indefinitely. Engineers evaluated whether portions could be incorporated into future development rather than removed entirely. Economic pressure encouraged pragmatism. Governments balancing reconstruction budgets found it difficult to justify unlimited spending on structures that, while unwanted, no longer posed immediate danger. Passage of time further complicated decisions. Each year that a tower remained standing made its presence more familiar. Vegetation appeared in cracks. Surrounding neighborhoods adapted. New construction emerged nearby. Children grew up viewing the towers as ordinary landmarks despite their extraordinary origins. Yet beneath this appearance of permanence, official discussions continued. Reports were written. Cost estimates were revised. Demolition studies circulated among municipal departments. The question had not disappeared. It had simply become harder to answer. By the early stages of post-war reconstruction, one fact was impossible to ignore: flak towers had survived not because governments wished to preserve them, but because destroying them demanded resources that recovering cities could scarcely afford. Their future remained uncertain. Some would face explosives. Others would acquire unexpected civilian roles. A few would challenge planners and engineers for generations. The war that created them was over, yet their story had entered a new phase, one shaped not by military necessity, but by budgets, concrete, and the stubborn reality of structures built to outlast destruction itself. The longer the flak towers remained standing, the more difficult their fate became to determine. In the immediate aftermath of the war, demolition had seemed like the obvious solution. These structures had been built for a military purpose that no longer existed. They occupied valuable urban land and served as constant reminders of a period that cities were trying to leave behind. Yet, as reconstruction accelerated through the late 1940s and into the following decades, officials discovered that the question was no longer simply whether the towers should disappear. It had become whether anyone could justify the immense cost of making them disappear. Berlin. Several of the surviving towers eventually became targets of major demolition programs. The occupying authorities and city planners agreed that some structures were too large and too disruptive to remain indefinitely. Yet bringing them down proved every bit as difficult as engineers had feared. Enormous quantities of explosives were packed into carefully drilled chambers. Detonations shook surrounding districts. Clouds of dust rose over the city, and then complete destruction often remained elusive. Portions of towers survived blasts that would have leveled ordinary buildings many times over. In some cases, engineers resorted to burying remnants beneath artificial hills rather than attempting total removal. The result was an unusual form of post-war landscape engineering beneath parks and elevated green spaces. Fragments of military architecture remained entombed under thousands of tons of earth. One of the most notable examples emerged in Berlin's Friedrichshain district. The massive tower complex there resisted demolition efforts to such an extent that authorities ultimately covered large sections with rubble and soil. What appeared to visitors as a natural hill concealed one of the most formidable structures of the wartime era. Similar solutions reflected a practical reality. Complete eradication often demanded more money, labour, and equipment than reconstruction planners were willing to commit. Freeing portions of the structures became cheaper than removing them. In effect, some towers vanished from sight without truly disappearing. Hamburg followed a different path there. Several flak towers survived not because demolition was impossible, but because alternative uses gradually appeared more economical. Post-war Germany rebuilt its economy. Practical concerns increasingly outweighed symbolic ones. Reinforced concrete structures offered advantages that could not easily be replicated. Their interiors were dry, secure, and extraordinarily durable. While originally intended to protect against air attack, these characteristics also made them useful for storage, commercial activity, and infrastructure support. One Hamburg tower eventually found a role as a media and communications facility. Another became associated with energy infrastructure. Decades after the war, spaces once designed for anti-aircraft command operations contained entirely different equipment serving civilian needs. Transformation was gradual rather than dramatic. There was no single moment when military architecture became civilian architecture. Instead, necessity encouraged adaptation. A reused room represented money saved on new construction. Every preserved wall represented concrete that no longer needed to be poured elsewhere. Nowhere was this process more visible than in Vienna. Like Berlin, where extensive demolition reduced the number of surviving towers, Vienna retained several of its giant structures largely intact. The economics were difficult to ignore. Demolishing them would have required extraordinary investment with little direct return. Consequently, they remained standing while the city evolved around them. Their presence created an unusual relationship between past and present. Residential neighborhoods expanded nearby. Parks welcomed visitors, filled with traffic. Yet towering above these ordinary urban activities stood structures whose scale continued to dominate entire districts. Viennese towers acquired new functions almost by accident. Their thick concrete walls provided exceptionally stable internal environments. Temperature fluctuations remained limited. External noise struggled to penetrate. These characteristics attracted interest from institutions requiring secure storage conditions. Portions of certain towers were adapted for archives and specialized facilities. Others hosted technical infrastructure. What had once been designed to withstand aerial bombardment now protected documents, equipment, and services essential to civilian life. Not every tower found a new purpose. Some remained largely abandoned for years, standing as silent monuments to practicality rather than preservation. Maintenance costs were kept minimal. Access remained restricted. Their interiors gathered dust, while the cities around them modernized. Yet even unused towers revealed an important truth about post-war Europe. Destruction had not erased everything. Certain structures proved so resistant to removal that societies learned to coexist with them instead. Financial dimension remained central throughout these decisions. Demolition costs continued rising as labour, environmental regulations, and urban density increased. A tower that had been expensive to remove in 1946 often became even more expensive decades later. Municipal governments faced competing priorities, including transportation projects, housing initiatives, schools, hospitals, and utility upgrades. Against these demands, spending vast sums solely to eliminate a concrete structure became increasingly difficult to justify. Practicality repeatedly favored adaptation over destruction. As years turned into decades, another factor emerged. Historical distance altered public perception. Immediately after the war, many residents viewed the towers primarily as military remnants. Later generations encountered them differently. Young people who had never experienced wartime bombing saw unusual buildings rather than direct memories. Architects studied them as engineering achievements. Historians examined their role in shaping city landscapes. Researchers documented construction methods that had enabled such extraordinary durability. Without changing physically, the towers acquired new meanings simply because the world around them changed. This shift did not transform them into universally admired landmarks. Their origins remained inseparable from the circumstances that produced them. Yet public discussion increasingly focused on questions of preservation, adaptation, and urban identity rather than immediate removal. Some towers became subjects of architectural studies. Those appeared in exhibitions examining the physical legacy of the war. Their value was no longer measured solely in military terms. Instead, they became evidence of how cities absorb and reinterpret difficult inheritances. The most striking aspect of their survival was the contrast between intended lifespan and actual lifespan. Many wartime facilities disappeared quickly after defeat. Equipment was scrapped. Factories changed ownership. Vehicles were dismantled. Weapons programs ended. Flak towers followed a different trajectory because their scale made simple disposal impossible. They were too large to ignore and too expensive to erase. In a sense, their survival resulted less from deliberate preservation than from economic reality. Concrete, steel, labor, and money determined their future more than ideology ever could. Today, visitors walking through parts of Berlin, Hamburg, or Vienna may encounter the consequences of those post-war decisions. Some towers remain visible, their massive forms still dominating surrounding districts. Others lie concealed beneath landscaped terrain. A few have become integrated into civilian infrastructure in ways that their designers could never have anticipated. Their guns are gone. Their military systems vanished long ago. Yet the structures themselves continue to occupy physical space within modern cities. Their existence offers a lesson about the aftermath of war that is often overlooked. The end of fighting does not automatically erase the material world that conflict creates. Factories, bunkers, harbours, and fortifications can outlive the political systems that built them. Sometimes they disappear quickly, sometimes they remain for generations, because removal proves more difficult than retention. The flak towers belonged firmly to the second category. Their fate was shaped not by dramatic decisions, but by budgets, engineering calculations, transportation costs, and the practical limitations of reconstruction. In the end, the story of the German Flak Towers is not primarily a story about military architecture. It is a story about what happens when structures built for one purpose survive into a world that no longer needs them. Some were blasted apart. Some were buried. Some were abandoned. Some were repurposed. Yet none followed the straightforward path that planners initially imagined when the war ended. Their enormous concrete shells forced governments, engineers, and cities to adapt their expectations to reality. Long after the guns fell silent, the towers remained. Not because they were loved, not because they were protected, but because they had been built with such determination that even peace struggled to remove them. Across changing decades, expanding cities, and successive generations, they stood as reminders that the physical aftermath of war can endure far longer than the conflict itself. And in that endurance, buried beneath hills, repurposed behind modern facades, or still visible against the skyline, the final chapter of the Flak Towers was written not by the war that created them, but by the peacetime world that inherited them. If you enjoyed deeply researched World War II aftermath stories focused on what happened after the fighting stopped, consider following for more documentaries exploring the forgotten fate of the war's surviving machines, structures, and landscapes. Battlefields disappeared. The consequences often remained.